Olena Halushka is a board member of the Ukrainian NGO Anti-Corruption Action Center and co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. She's also worked as a chief of international advocacy at the post-Maidan coalition of 80 CSOs, the Reanimation Package of Reforms. Olena is a contributor to the Atlantic Council, Kyiv Independent, and many other publications, including Washington Post, EU Observer, and Foreign Policy. And indeed, it is some of the recent articles on foreign policy that we are going to be diving into in more detail today. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please definitely put a like against this video if you think the material we create is useful and helpful, and definitely make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our daily content. Please also consider supporting Ukrainian charities, the links of which appear in the description of this video. It's incredibly important to help Ukrainians remain resilient. Well, there are few people who have done more to help Ukraine's resilience since Maidan, and that is Olena. And I'm delighted to welcome her back to the channel for, I think it's now the fourth time, but definitely not the last. Olena, welcome.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you very much for having me again. And indeed, that's my fourth time here, and I'm honored. Thanks.
It's the fifth, of course, if we count the event that we did in Lviv, which was almost exactly a year ago. But it's great, and we've got a lot of stuff. We probably won't get through all the topics that I've listed here. But let's start with the one we were talking just before we hit record. Ukraine is fighting one of the largest wars in Europe, if not the largest, since World War II, but at the same time is keeping its democratic process on track. Reforms of the legislature, judiciary, and various changes required to align it with potential future EU membership. And of course, Ukraine has come from the highly, I would say, Russified, highly sort of corrupt culture that was engendered by the Soviet Union. And yet this does not seem to be appreciated. You had a bit of, dare I say it, trouble recently with a journalist, an article produced in Foreign Policy, and decided to create a very powerful response to that. Could you give us a bit of background on how this happened and really what was wrong with the article that was produced that you responded to?
Well, the problem with the reporting on Ukraine's corruption, which we very often see among the Western journalists and, even sometimes inside Ukraine, is that there is an overly big focus on Ukraine's hardships. And you know always that good news do not sell newspapers. And that's something which we suffer a lot from. Because does Ukraine still have corruption issues? Well, yes, that's true. And, it will be not fair to turn a blind eye on that. But what differs us from the way how Ukraine tries to be portrayed in the international media right now is that Ukrainians understand very well what is our home task, and we have the vision and roadmap how to move forward and how to build, transform our country. And we have a very huge appetite and hunger for that. Because if you take a look at what is the source and the demand for Ukraine's rule of law, anti-corruption reforms, this is the will of Ukrainian people, not the commitments, conditionalities of Ukrainian donors. So many people think that, it is European Union or IMF or the Americans who come to Ukraine and say, hey, do the reforms, transform your institutions, and then, one day you will be the part of the West. No, it is Ukrainian people who went out to the streets during the Revolution of Dignity in order to say enough is enough for the corrupt country full of cronyism, full of, other malpractices. We wanted rule of law, we wanted justice, we wanted zero corruption, respect to the human rights, police which is not beating protesters on the streets, and that was the will of Ukrainian people. And then foreign conditionalities were just a vehicle, just a tool to transform this will of Ukrainian people into a very clear policy decisions to be implemented by the Ukrainian government. So, and I have the feeling that, this big picture is very often missed, because if you report, for example, or if you consider any corruption scandal, and I had a lot of the discussions and conversations with foreign journalists, with foreign decision makers, who are asking like, oh, you're having another scandal in the Ministry of Defense. How come you're defending from the genocidal war and you're having those bad things happening? I mean, for me as the citizen of Ukraine, it is absolutely disgusting that things like that are happening in Ukraine. But we have to acknowledge that the fact that we have civil society and investigative journalists that are watchdogging and revealing and reporting on scandals like this is a sign of the maturing democracy. Then you have anti-corruption institutions that are doing their job even when the country defends from the full-scale war. That's the sign of the institutional achievements that were built after 2014. And then you have zero tolerance among the society, which is not going, to accept anything like this, which results in the dismissals, criminal cases, and justice in anything like that. So, of course, the scandal itself is the problem, but it is how the system and the society reacts to problems like this, which has to be treated as the sign of whether everything is going in the right direction or not, or the wrong direction. Because I hate whataboutism, but we are regularly seeing, corruption scandals appearing even in the mature democracies. But the question is how their prosecution reacts, how their courts react. That's the way how we are assessing the temperature, the average temperature. And I think that Ukraine is doing a lot in terms of moving into the right direction.
And there's two interesting things that never seem to appear in these articles. One is simply to focus on corruption as an issue, whereas it's always seemed to me that in somewhere like Russia, nepotism is actually a far more destructive force and is far less often discussed, because if you get someone who lacks the sort of talent and skill and is placed in a high-ranked position, the damage they can do over the long term is potentially far greater than corruption itself. And we see nepotism is potentially an issue in donor countries as well as Russia. So that's the first one. The other one, of course, is the focus is always on these judicial reforms and on administrative reforms. It seems to ignore the huge influence of civic society in Ukraine, the pressure of debate, the pressure for change that is like this constant gas pressing out on all institutions, not always successful, but helping to keep them accountable. That's a subtle process, which I think a lot of these articles and journalists miss. Do you agree with that? And how could things be improved in terms of communicating them?
Well, first thing is, I'm always joking, but this is not actually a joke. That's the truth, that corruption inside Russia is our ally. And, we want as much corruption to erode the Russian country as possible, because it's about weakening their capacities to be waging this genocidal war against Ukraine. That's why, there's also always something that whether the fight against corruption or anti-corruption investigations in Russia are actually helping Russian war efforts or are undermining Russian war efforts, as some of the Russian opposition leaders are trying to portray. So the more corruption will exist in Russia, the better, for everybody around Russia, because the potential of Russia to wage the wars will be decreasing. And on this second issue, which is the judicial reform, it is very important, of course. I mean, we have prioritized judicial reform in Ukraine since 2014, and we've passed a very long way starting from international partners not wanting to prioritize the judicial reform because it's a purely sovereign issue. You cannot have international partners making any advice or conditionalities regarding the courts, to subsequent understanding that judicial reform is the mother of all reforms. You cannot avoid it. You cannot build strong institutions in other areas, like, for example, fight against corruption, prosecutor's office, police, without cleaning judicial reform. Then we, with the help and with the participation of international, with the observing of the international partners, we've tried to implement in Ukraine the best European standards of complete judicial independence without cleaning the courts. And we eventually made it even worse, because the problem, the system with all of the problems inside it, corrupt judges, cronyism, nepotism, was cemented. I mean, in the years that was approximately 2014, 2017. And after this, we made a few steps back and restarted all of the judicial governance bodies with the participation of foreign experts who helped us to vet the new members or candidates to the judicial governance bodies. And judicial governance bodies, that's the judges for judges. So they take the decision on hiring, firing, administrative, disciplinary cases, transition between the courts. So they are the main decision-making authority inside the judiciary. And right now we are seeing this result. But the achievements and progress in judicial reform was the result of, as you said, a very big pressure coming from the civil society, because we observed this judicial attempts since 2014. We've seen what went wrong. We analyzed what was the reason for that, and we came up with new innovative solutions. Because Ukrainian experience showed that if you simply take standards that work in the Netherlands or in UK or in any other mature democracy and try to blindly apply this in the maturing democracy, which is struggling, for the full transition, it won't work. At a certain point, it may even do worse. So you need to be creative. And I think that right now, Ukrainian experience is very interesting, because that's something which can help to transform other maturing, emerging democracies that are also struggling with their rule of law problems. So, Ukrainian reforms is not only about Ukraine, it's about the blueprint for other countries facing similar issues.
And that's a really interesting question, because it suggests that not just the media, but also experts underestimate what is required, and the multi-layered approach, including a significant, civil component, not just an administrative component, to actually de-Russify a country, to take a country that's been under a Soviet regime, a system that is designed to dissolve all trust between people and their institutions, between people and their communities, designed to cover up history, identity, culture, designed to prevent any kind of civic space from emerging. I find it constantly extraordinary that Ukraine has preserved so much of these things, and that they were there almost in hibernation, waiting for the opportunity to re-emerge when Russian power didn't disappear, but was able to be sort of pushed back. Is this sort of underappreciated, what's required to de-Russify or de-Sovietize a country? And is that same problem, perhaps, or that same underestimation of the challenge made by Russian opposition, and indeed those who are sympathetic to the idea of a democratic future Russia? It's my view that it's an extremely complex and difficult task, and one that is going to be far more difficult to enact than is assumed. And of course, it doesn't have the same culture, it doesn't have the same sort of civic movement that Ukraine had.
Well, if you take a look at Ukraine's history, it has always been, about our resistance and about our fight for independence. And Ukrainian elites were always one of the primary targets, be it, of the Russian Empire, be it of the Soviet Union, be it of the, Russia after 1991, when Ukraine received independence. And what was Holodomor famine in 1932, 1933 about? It was about destroying Ukrainian nation because of our possibility of standing and fighting for ourselves. What were all of the deportations of Ukrainian elites, in all of the different areas, not only like political activists, but, cultural, poets, writers, so anybody, who could help lifting Ukrainian morale and spirit, they were deported, they were destroyed, they were executed, murdered, those who managed to get to the exile, they saved themselves. But it was a targeted policy of destroying best people of Ukrainian state. And that's exactly what continues to happen right now during this war. Because if you take a look whom Ukraine is losing in this war, this is indeed our best people, because when the full-scale invasion started, they took up arms, whatever were their kind of jobs and activities before the full-scale war, they took up arms and they went to defend our sovereignty. So, that's what differs, how we are different from Russians. That were what distinguished us from Russians, because Russians are not ready to resist as they say, dictator. They are going, to this war, and they are ready to die in this imperialistic war, but they won't resist this war, despite the chances of, dying on the front line are much higher, than dying if they resist this dictatorship and this war and Russian policies. But they nevertheless still go there and, die. Why? Because this is Russian war and not Putin's war, as many people want to portray it. And Ukrainians, we are fighters, and we were fighting for the democracy. We were fighting for independence and the possibility to have our sovereign state. Then we were fighting, for the democracy, for the rule of law, for having the strong state with people living decent lives. Now we are again fighting against Russian imperialism. And when many people, speak about the democratization of Russia, when Kara-Murza is telling that Europeans have to accept that, Russians are part of Europe. Russians are not part of Europe. And this Russia, which is currently, existing, it is an empire. And without losing this war, like badly losing this war, without the imperialization of Russia, without, accountability, tribunal for Russian aggression, trials for the Russian war crimes, all of those unimaginable war crimes, without paying reparations, the damages for 2 years of the full-scale war already reached almost $500 billion. That's a lot of money. That is significantly more than the amount of the frozen Russian assets in the West, which is $300 billion. Without all those things, Russia will never change. And those people that are saying that freeze the war and you will have peace, they don't understand that freezing the war now would simply mean giving Russia time to rearm, giving them a breather, and give them time to prepare for a much, much larger war afterwards. Because if Russia knows that they can unleash the full-scale invasion against the sovereign state, commit absolutely horrible war crimes, bombing the Children's Cancer Hospital, occupying Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, blowing up the Kakhovka Dam, rapes, killings, shooting down children, whatever else, you name it. The list is very, very long, and they will face absolutely no accountability, and they will be rewarded with keeping all of the occupied territories. Why would they stop their imperialistic war? And that's something which very many people do not understand, that democratic Russia won't appear from nowhere. Russian society, entire society, has to pass a very deep transformation, de-imperialization, decolonization, freeing of the nations that are right now enslaved in Russia. And only after that, we would be able to speak about, the possibility of coexistence with them. And unfortunately, and I'm terrified that many of those issues that I name here, they are not on the international agenda anymore. So people are fine having the a country which, commits all of those horrible war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, having a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and everybody is fine with that. Russia is given time to pull together the coalition of tyrannies. In 2014, it has been Russia against Ukraine. In 2022, it's Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, with the increasing participation and support received from China. The coalition of tyrannies need to have as much chaos in the world as possible. They need to have as many theaters of the war happening, across entire globe as possible, because they understand that democracies cannot manage that many conflicts simultaneously. And that's something which many people miss, this big picture, that this is not a regional war. This is not a bilateral conflict of Russia against Ukraine. This is just the beginning of the global crusade of autocracies against democracies. And the only way to stop it is not to have a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine, but to defeat Russia in Ukraine and convey the message to all of the other dictatorship that, changing borders of other countries by force is not gonna be allowed to happen in the 21st century.
And that potentially will not end this struggle, but at least it will give them pause for thought, and defeating one out of the four axis of authoritarian states will potentially strengthen us for the next stage in that struggle. So I think that's a really interesting point. And the point you made about Russia's historic targeting of particular groups and people, especially those who are activists, those who don't just sit passively and accept whatever rules are imposed on them, that seems to continue to the present day. You have Crimean Tatar activists who are an especial target for torture and coercion. You have the Azov fighters, who are some of the most experienced and determined in Ukraine. Russia's they destroy and torture everything they see, but they have some especial vindictiveness, I think, reserved for certain groups and certain people. And the common thread seems to be that if you are an activist, if you are going far above and beyond what the average citizen does, you will make yourself a target of Russia's aggression.
Yes, that's absolutely true, unfortunately. And, if you take a look at one of the cases, Olenivka, when last year in summer, Russians basically blew up the temporary center when the prisoners of war were held, the one from Azov, and many people died and many people were wounded. And, there is no investigation into that case. The UN Commission basically, did nothing to find out the truth. Russia is spreading their disinformation, and they are not basically, exchanging those injured people in the Olenivka Terrorist Act, and they are not returning them back to Ukraine. And this is just one of the cases. And, you know, the Crimean Tatars, there are persecutions. Just yesterday, I saw the news that one civic journalist from the Crimean Tatar Solidarity Project, he has very serious heart issues, and if he is not receiving the proper medical treatment as soon as possible, then, you know, that's risking his life. And unfortunately, Russians are completely disregarding this. And I don't understand why there is so little international outcry on cases like this. Because when you are having, you know, ICRC posting, you know, fuck yous that frequently asked questions, you know, that what are we doing in Ukraine? And they are giving the number, a few thousand prisoners of war they have visited. You know, they are not specifying how many prisoners of war they visited in Ukraine and how many they visited in Russia. They are just giving, you know, the aggregated figure, you know, creating the false perception that it's probably, you know, the same figures, you know, from both sides. Well, this is not true, because Ukraine's human rights ombudsman clearly mentioned that, you know, all of those prisoners of war that were released, they say that they never seen ICRC representative. You know, Russians are literally torturing those people, making absolutely horrible things to them. And nobody is even, I mean, nobody from the international organizations that have a clear mandate to fight for people like that are not doing this. So that's why it's very important to make sure that, you know, the global communities, Ukrainians abroad, that they are demanding their governments to continue working towards releasing all of Ukrainians from the Russian captivity. We have to return our people, and every life, every Ukrainian life matters for us.
Ukraine continues its fight back against not just this physical violence that's taking place, but also the attempts to penetrate Ukrainian society and corrupt its institutions. And one that you've reposted a lot on, and I think there is going to be a debate here, because I know in the US, various PR firms have been appointed by Russian proxies, assets, and agents to try and stir this story up. And this is the attempt to negate or remove the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church under Patriarch Kirill, that until now, remarkably, has been allowed to operate in Ukraine. Now, for those who are of a cynical mindset, like myself, I don't believe the Russian Orthodox Church is a spiritual organization. It is a spying organization, is organization of KGB assets and killers. I'm going to do an episode on that later in the week. But this idea doesn't really penetrate to everyone, especially evangelicals and many believers in the US who are influential on policy making, and especially in the GOP. It's not well understood that actually the senior hierarchy of the Orthodox Church are intelligence officers. They're not really spiritual people and priests, and they are just as mired in materialistic corruption as all the other, you know, higher ups in the Russian system. So how has this law come about? Why has it taken so long? And how physically now is Ukraine going to be able to cleanse itself of these essentially spy networks masquerading as churches on the territory of Ukraine?
Well, you're absolutely right, you know, and it was very worrying that there were some kind of messages thrown into the media space that Ukraine banned Christianity. You know, Ukraine is prosecuting the Orthodox Christians, whatever else. Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I can tell you that, you know, Christians are not persecuted in Ukraine, unlike they are persecuted in Russia, especially, you know, in the Crimea. They have recently dismantled the last Ukrainian church. and, the way how Russia bombs churches in Ukraine is basically, who is the real threat to Christians and Christianity in Ukraine. But with regards to the Moscow Church in Ukraine, well, you're absolutely right that it was, and it has always been for the decades, one of the tools of FSB work in Ukraine, and the attempts, to control, to influence over our country, over our discourse, over our people, including attempts to brainwash them. So I think that this step was very important, and we have the feeling, that it took too long, but it is still a historic important process. And I have to say that during the previous President Poroshenko, when Ukraine received Tomos, Ukraine's Orthodox Church received Tomos, that was the first, step in order to basically, build and strengthen Ukraine's Orthodox Church and make sure that, it is cleaned out of the KGB agents. And right now, it's the kind of the continuation of this process. And the churches will have certain period of time. I don't remember, I think 9 months, in order to transit from the Moscow Church to Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And, that would make the process pretty smooth for them. And over the last 2 years, we had around up to 100 cases confirmed, with the criminal charges of the priests and members of the Orthodox Church spying for Russia and, taking part in the subversive activities, which is kind of, documented by Ukrainian prosecutor's office, and those cases are very clear. So as Ukraine is eliminating and closing the loopholes for Russia to influence, control, and put pressure at our state, I think that this step is very important, of course.
And there's a topic that we cannot fail but to mention here. Again, we were discussing this a little bit before we hit record, and that is the Kursk offensive. I think this is still perhaps misunderstood in the Western media when they focus on the day-to-day and the minor, extensions of territory and so on. It seems to me, and in some discussions I've had recently, that this is just the first stage in a multi-stage strategy. And the publicly stated reasons for the Kursk incursions are quite possibly not the full set of intentions and strategic objectives. But let's start with the impact it's had on morale, because it certainly seems that one of the objectives was to really pick people up, both in the military and the civilian sphere, because after more than 2 years of war, clearly it is both physically and mentally draining and exhausting for people. And support for the government, support for the war was starting to slip slightly in some of the opinion polls. People were starting to, they understand, as you say, clearly that a bad peace negotiation is what would result, but more people were moving towards the position of, well, let's do that anyway. Kursk, has it turned that around? Has it provided a significant boost for morale? And how important overall is it at this stage of the war that Ukraine has decided to take such a bold and decisive action?
Well, you were absolutely right that from the military strategy perspective, there are a lot of unclear things, and I definitely won't speculate on that because I'm not a military expert. And even if I knew this information, that's not something that has to be discussed publicly. But from the perspective of morale, of course, that was a very important boost. But I would even say that there is one kind of, underreported or misunderstood issue. And somebody on Twitter joked, and I liked it very much, that, we are seeking in the Kursk region for the red lines and cannot find them, because from the very beginning, 2022, all of the Ukraine's legitimate self-defense steps were always limited by the Western red lines, always, from the very beginning. I remember very well, in March 2022, when we were asking for military aid for Ukraine, the flows of which stopped because partners thought that Ukraine will fail in 3 days, then 1 week, then maybe 2 weeks, then maybe 1 month, And when we were asking, we heard that, well, let's see how Ukraine will manage to repel the Russian invasion. Then, Ukraine started receiving but the Soviet-style weapons without modern weapons. Then, it took us a lot of time for Ukraine, to advocate for new howitzers and MLRS. Then, there was this whole long campaign for the modern battle tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, Free the Leopard campaign. Then, fighter jets took us even longer. And right now we are facing a very unjustified, I would say, ban on striking legitimate military targets inside Russia. And when you're having, the border regions, Sumy region, Kharkiv region, I'm not even speaking about front lines, where Russians are bombing with the very powerful glide bombs, and we do not have means and tools to shoot down the fighter jets that are bringing those bombs on the heads of Ukrainian military, Ukrainian civilians, kids, elderly people, simply because, we are not allowed to strike the airfields where Russians are, having those bombers standing between their killing missions. I mean, that's very unfair. And somebody also had a poster at the pro-Ukrainian rally that why our Western partners are more preoccupied in guarding Russian military bases over protecting Ukrainian children. And, when the bombing of Ohmedit Cancer Hospital, 1 day before the NATO summit, faced absolutely no accountability. Absolutely not a single sanction was adopted. I'm not even speaking about the right to strike back. I mean, that's unfair. And I think that if we talk about Kursk, it's super important to show our partners that all of the red lines are simply inside their heads, because Ukraine never, ever attacked Russia. Ukraine is defending. And we are a smaller country. I mean, our economy is smaller. Our manpower is smaller. We cannot win this war by simply, throwing our people on the front line like Russia is doing. I mean, not to mention that we are actually valuing the lives of our people. So we can win only with the asymmetric, only with the creative steps and creative, the tactical moves. And I think that our partners should finally stop, to be afraid and scared of Russia, and stop this escalation management, because Russia has already escalated this war to an absolutely all of the possible means. They are, fighting the most aggressive and the most violent war against Ukraine. Simultaneously, they have intensified and scaled up subversive activities against Europe. I mean, GPS jamming in Baltics, arson attacks, assassination attempts, sabotage of the critical infrastructure, etc. It's all those things that are already happening, and hoping that by not letting Ukraine strike the territory of Russia, the war won't be escalated. I mean, it's a very naive view. So it's very important to make the right conclusions. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing yet our partners making the right conclusions from the ongoing developments.
And Zelensky has got, as the Kursk offensive has rolled out, Zelensky has become more outspoken in a way. He is speaking more truth to power, I'd say, and giving sort of veiled criticism of allies in public. Now, I know that irritates the allies, but I think it's absolutely right that where Ukraine sees an injustice or where Ukraine sees some inefficiency, they point it out, because these are having a tremendous cost in terms of military and civilian lives. Specifically, some of the things he's mentioned is the slow provision, not just of the 300 billion, but simply the 50 billion, which is the interest on those Russian assets. The fact that this is endlessly delayed through various European institutions puts terrible pressure on Ukrainian budget and ability to be resilient. But Zelensky has also called out the delays in shipments of armaments and munitions and supplies, not just new tranches, but what's already been promised and allocated. And he specifically called out the US, UK, and France. How important is it for allies to really get a sense of urgency and deliver on the commitments they've made to Ukraine in a timely fashion?
Well, it's super important. A couple of months ago, Romanian president mentioned publicly that, you know, the West hasn't delivered half of what was promised. And, you know, that puts us in a very awkward situation, because on one hand, we are having a lot of statements, and, you know, almost every single day, somebody promises something, you know, to Ukraine. Societies are hearing this, they are listening to this, and they do not understand why Ukrainians, you know, are coming and asking again and are showing dissatisfaction instead of being super grateful. But then you take a look at the actual shipments, and you are seeing that, you know, many are lagging behind, many are delaying. And, you know, one of the examples that I always use, because I want, you know, I don't repeat things like this because I'm nasty and I want, you know, to stress on partners' mistakes, but I want these mistakes not to be repeated because it's about the lives of Ukrainian people. I mean, main battle tanks, imagine what would be their efficiency for the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive in 2022 and compare to their efficiency, you know, in 2023, 2024. I mean, it's absolutely different because the dynamics of the war changes significantly. And those tools that are very effective on the front line, you know, today, they might not be effective in a year. And what worked in 2022 might not work in 2024. So the things should come in time. And right now, our most pressing need is air defense. And, you know, Ukrainian government has been advocating for the Patriots, you know, but also SAMP-T, NASAMS, IRIS-T, and all of those systems since March, when Russians restarted their energy terrorist campaign. And over the spring and 1 month of summer, they have destroyed, you know, half of our energy generation capacities comparing to 2023. That's a lot. We need those air defenses in order to protect our energy system before the next winter, because, you know, we already had very long power outages in July when the weather was very hot and our energy system did not cope with the pressure. As the winter will be approaching, we'll be having, you know, longer and longer power outages up to a couple of hours of electricity per day. And that would mean, it's not only about electricity, it's about, I don't know, functioning of your apartment. Many people are having electric stoves, without the gas boilers, the whatever else. And all those things, they can work only with the electricity. But it's also about, pumping the water supplies. It's about sewage. It's about elevators. And it basically paralyzes the life of the ordinary people, especially in the big towns. And it may also affect the heating. And without heating in the sub-zero temperature, people won't be able, to survive the next winter. What does that mean? That means that Europe will face much more new refugees, millions of new refugees, which will demand more money spent on housing them. And that's a kind of, again, a domino effect. That could be prevented if Ukraine receives the air defense systems. But we've heard a lot of the promises of the air defense systems, but it's not clear when they are coming. I mean, Germany has delivered their promises, but what about other countries? And, there are many examples like this, and every day of the delay, it costs us the life of our people. That is why we are pushing that hard. That is why we continue requesting, because we warned from the very beginning that protracted war would cost much, much more than the decisive mobilization, push, and support for Ukrainian victory. And right now, we are basically, facing the consequences of inaction in 2022 and 2023.
And Russia continues to show its true face, which is as a terrorist. And one of the impactful things that you reposted on your Twitter account earlier in the week was the strike. I think it was Ann Ackerman writing about this, but it was the strike on Ukraine's first green school. An extraordinary piece of idealism and modernity. And Russia has quite clearly targeted it to destroy it, not because it's producing tons of energy and whatever, because of its strategic significance, but it just seems that Russia wants to destroy anything that is modern, that it doesn't have, anything that Ukrainians take pride in, and which demonstrate that they are, part of the Western world as opposed to the Russian Ruski Mir.
Well, that's basically their scorched earth tactics, that they are destroying whatever they can destroy. They understand that they cannot capture Ukraine. So, they moved to the plan of destroying as much as possible in order to make Ukraine unlivable, in order to depopulate Ukraine, to force as many people, especially, mothers with children, because children, it's the future of our state, to force them out of Ukraine and to make sure that Ukraine will be a failed state. That's their eventual goal. And I'm absolutely, sure that that's one of the intentions why Russians are pushing for this temporary peace, because they understand that, many people might, think twice where they would want, to plan for their future, especially if they have small kids, knowing that their kids might be fighting this war in their next phase if Russia is not stopped and if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine. And yes, you're absolutely right that Russians are destroying whatever they can to, be it a green school, be it a children's cafe in the Zaporizhia region a couple of days ago, where Russians killed 15-year-old teenager, churches, schools, hospitals, museums, whatever else, residential houses. They are doing, that's the terrorism. That's the state level terrorism. And this is not, a kind of random damages. This is an absolutely intentional policy, a pattern that they want to scale up. If they cannot control Ukraine, then they will make Ukraine unlivable to Ukrainians. And that's something what we are trying to explain to our partners, that democratic, sovereign Ukraine, with the borders, international borders restored, that's the security guarantee also for entire of Europe. And it is basically not only Ukraine interested in being integrated into EU and NATO, it's an absolutely of the mutual benefit, because, both EU and NATO absolutely wouldn't want to have, additional, Russian army much closer to Poland or to Baltic states. And that's a strategic vision on this war, which unfortunately I have the feeling often misses.
Last question, and I really don't want to leave this one to last, but I think it's important to mention. You mentioned earlier the naivety of which many in the media approach Russian oppositionists. I mention this because, of course, there's been the recent story where 3 key Russian opposition voices have been released, and they've been tremendously vocal, giving interviews in both English and Russian. And unfortunately, they do suck up a lot of oxygen. And unfortunately, some of the things they've said has been less than ideal, I would say. How concerned are you that there are institutions, media, academics in the West who still seem to give precedence to Russian voices over Ukrainian voices? And how worried should we be that some of the more nonsensical things these individuals have said is actually taken seriously? Because it's my view that they themselves dramatically underestimate how difficult it's going to be to transform Russia in the way Ukraine has been able to transform itself. They are not observing and learning the lessons of Ukraine, because I think there's an inbuilt imperial bias going on there, a kind of chauvinism. And they also overestimate their own role within the opposition. I mean, Karamazov is an interesting figure, but is barely known in Russia. I think if you stop people on the street anywhere in Russia, most of them would not have heard of him. So there's extraordinary things going on, and there's this distorting lens, which unfortunately we seem to fall for. How concerned are you about this, and how are we going to be able to sort of put these things in perspective for Western media and, let's say, policy advisors?
Well, I think that many in the West do not understand that anti-Putin doesn't mean anti-Russian imperialism, or that anti-war doesn't mean pro-Russian defeat. Because, when you are saying that, yes, I'm against this war, well, I believe that they are against this war. But, when you're asking, then how do you see this war should end? That, well, maybe ceasefire, maybe whatever else, Crimea is part of Russia. And I mean, I would expect those people to be, if they truly want the bright future for Russia, to be speaking very vocally about Ukrainian victory, about, full decisive Russian defeat, about collective responsibility of the Russian society, which they absolutely deny when they say that sanctions should be targeted only at Putin and his cronies, and ordinary people should not feel those sanctions. That reparations should be paid, that there should finally be de-imperialization of Russia, that, the indigenous people of Russia deserve their own countries, states, whatever else. And anything short of this real and frank conversation, I mean, it's noise. But I understand why they are not speaking things like that, because they are catering Russian audience, because they know very well that Russian audience won't accept, conversations about their responsibility, because even, Russian liberals that left Russia and are right now in exile and are anti-war, they think that their main, that they don't see any responsibility for this war. They don't see any responsibility for the Putin's regime. They think that their only goal is to survive, to take care of themselves, and to return someday to Russia and to, I don't know, build a fantastic, bright Russia of the future. They completely misunderstand, or they don't want to understand this consciously, the origins, the roots of the problems. I mean, in 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia tried to hold, liberal democratic reforms. Yeltsin was considered to be the liberal president. Even Putin at the very beginning was seen by somebody, as the hope for democracy. How did that end? That ended with what we have right now, full-scale genocide of Ukrainians. Why? Because this is not Russian people are slaves of Putin. This is Putin's regime is the consequence of the lack of any responsibility of the Russian society for all of their crimes. I mean, Russians celebrate the victory in the World War II. They never get any accountability for being the aggressor in the World War II. It was, pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that basically started the World War II, the occupation of Poland, and Soviet Union was the aggressor back then. There was no accountability for Holodomor famine. There was no accountability for those absolutely horrible crimes that were happening inside Soviet Union against, the indigenous people. And, a lot of the other things. And they are not even, going through, processing, assessing this. And without this conversation, I mean, there are absolutely no prospects for any change. The Russian society should pass absolutely the similar transition and transformation like the German society. And only after that, there might be any, conversations about the, democracy, Russia being part of Europe and whatever else they are pushing, including the lifting of sanctions. I'm sure that sanctions should be kept up until, that there is this reparations paid, war ended, and Russian society passed the transition. And I know, that many people, including Russian liberals, they are advocating for lifting sanctions right now. What for? Russians continue full-scale terrorism, full-scale genocide, full-scale war, and we should lift sanctions because poor Russian people, cannot eat fancy French cheese or whatever else, sanctions impact the everyday lives of the ordinary Russians.
Just to sort of add a tail note onto that, return the kidnapped people, the children who are being brainwashed on Russian territory, actually prosecute and hand over prosecution officers of the army who it's been demonstrated have committed war crimes. Obviously, we know many of them probably killed in subsequent meat waves and so on, but an acknowledgement at least of those prosecutions and those sentences should be accepted by the Russian government and the Russian people. Of course, that is a long-term prospect. I am always heartened to hear there are people like you fighting for these justices, people with such an articulate and strong voice and energy that seems relentless. It's extraordinarily inspiring what you and your colleagues do. Olena, thank you so much for coming back onto the channel.
Thank you very much for having me, Jonathan.